Chapter 6. News of Manco's revolt and Juan's death had broke throughout the land. In Lima, Francisco wrote a letter to his correspondents in Mexico, where he pleaded to send more men to aid Cusco, while Almagro, on his expedition to search for El Dorado, immediately spared 50 of his men to help the situation. It had been more than 2 months since Almagro's departure. His entrada headed south and followed the coast, and Almagro and his men were still confident, anticipating they would find something grand. Diego, in particular, possessed the confident air about him as he rode his horse down narrow, rocky trails. Stories from the local tribes emerged, and all had felt that El Dorado was very close. And for Almagro himself, the odds that his expeditions would find something seemed certain. But it never happened. Days turned into weeks, weeks forward into months. But the Almagros and their expedition still haven't found gold of any kind. For Francisco, however, it seemed as though he finally found his kingdom. What Francisco loved about Lima was the absence of things. He loved the absence of the Almagros. He loved that he no longer had to deal with his brothers. But what Francisco loved the most in Lima was that he could finally breathe, for Lima felt truly like home. In that time, Francisco took a wife, and he had made a palace of his own. Although his palace was small, Francisco's view was of the grand ocean and sands. He kept at his throne and sat on it until his rear and lower back ached. And each day, he held a marvelously peaceful view. Because both Almagro and Francisco were lost in their own dreams, they held Cusco as secondary, for both at the moment were too far away to be concerned. But in truth, that's how they wanted it. They knew if they so much as blinked, they would lose Cusco forever. They knew in order to keep control of it, they would have to fight for it over and over again. And if necessary, they would have to fight each other. They knew it too well. Yet, for the meanwhile, Cusco remained in constant battle. At sunrise, Manco joined his men in prayer. He took pride in his people and their devotion. He took pride in all the dead that lay on the ground and vowed they would not be forgotten. And his face remained calm. But deep down, Manco knew that his revolt was fallen at the seams. He knew Cusco was lost. Even though his people still outnumbered the Spanish, they gave up too much ground. The Spanish took control of too much territory and continued to replenish their growing forces. Fighting at this rate was simply pointless. The stench of the city after a week of battle was awful. What would it smell like in a month? What about a year? His people and his warriors were very much alive and their spirits intact, but Manco knew it was over. The decision would have to be made, but Manco knew his people deserved much more. Although it was a prideful feeling when he ordered each charge, it didn't make any sense to continue fighting. At least not in Cusco. As he looked on from the temple's perch, Manco knew that this would be the last day he'd ever see Cusco. But as he looked down, Manco saw the last platoon of his warriors gathered for a final charge, and a smile formed on his face. There were only 20 of them, but they were the fiercest men he had ever seen. He saw their war faces, and on each face he saw their dedication, commitment, and their great disdain for the Spanish. The warriors bowed when Manco approached, and together they whispered their sacred prayers to all their gods. They were ready and willing to die, and Manco gave them their blessings as he watched them dash to the walls and make their last attempt to defend Cusco. The warriors captured the crevice point of the walls. Then they yelled their war cry and attacked with spears and stones. When they got close enough, they choked the Spanish with their bare hands, and the Spanish shot back. Half of the warriors died within 2 minutes. The other half climbed up the walls and defended their ground. They armed themselves with Spanish swords. They speared and stabbed. They strangled and bled. But the Spanish kept coming, and they surrounded the warriors, killing them off one by one. And when the very last surviving warriors saw their inevitable end, they jumped off the cliffs and took their own lives. When it was over, Manco approached the royal court. With a simple nod of his head, he conceded. Immediately, the Incas fled Cusco in droves. Thousands upon thousands of people exited to the back entrance of the city and retreated north into the valley. Cusco still appeared in sight, but Manco tried not to look back. He continued to walk. His eyes teared through burning smoke. He stared at the harvested crop that started to spoil, and he smelled the burning corpses. Little by little, Cusco started to fade away. Little by little, the royal court's plan of surrender made more and more sense. Yet the entirety of the moment overwhelmed even the most reserved. While Mampoma paced towards Manco, they shared a look, but not much else. All the reasons in the world couldn't prevent Manco from crying, but he wasn't alone. Most of the Inca faces grew worn and weathered as they walked on. But the Incas did not forget to sing. They sang through their tears. They sang through the pain. They sang the lilted songs of their ancestors. And they sang the songs of Atahualpa. And their sweet songs continued. But the obvious question remained, where to next? Manco simply pointed to the jungle ahead, Machu Picchu and the sacred valley beyond. He pointed, staggered onwards, and his people followed. In Cusco, the brothers Pizarro did not celebrate their victory. The only remaining Incas were servants and slaves. The Spanish took complete control of the city, but they did so seethed with rage. Gonzalo himself lost all control of his emotions. He yelled from one end to the city to the other, and he stabbed anything that crossed his way. Hernando, on the other hand, kept quite still. During one afternoon, Gonzalo walked about the city, and for a straight hour he repeated a single phrase. Sometimes he whispered the phrase, other times he shouted it. His lips eroded in crust. His face grew red like a pomegranate, but his anger was pure and obsessed. Bastard! The bastard! Finally, Gonzalo approached Cura. He stared at her, lifted his hands, and slapped her across the face until she bled. Then he threw her to the ground and ordered his men to arrest her. Later, Gonzalo quartered her to the basement of the lower temples, and she was kept there indefinitely. Upon seeing this, Hernando immediately tried to calm Gonzalo with soothing words of reassurance, but his words rang empty and were left unheard. Even at an early age, Hernando knew that controlling Gonzalo was like trying to control a tidal wave, and it was even more apparent now. With Juan dead and Francisco cut off in Lima, Hernando felt not just like a brother to Gonzalo, but a pseudo-father. And with that burden came the sheer inability to communicate. The more Hernando pleaded for Gonzalo to relax, the more Gonzalo spat to the ground. They spoke of their options. They talked about Juan and cried when the silence took over. Internally, Hernando knew that there was only one thing Gonzalo was thinking about, and that was Manco. Hernando knew that Gonzalo's only intent was to do as much damage as he could, and Hernando sighed a heavy sigh. Again, the brothers talked amongst themselves, and the rounds of the obvious began. And again, the rage returned. Gonzalo's eyes grew wide, hungry, and bitter. He peered into the jungle and grunted. He flashed his eyes from left to right. Then he spoke his insanity to Hernando. "We'll find the bastard. He can't be far." Yes, but we have to be smart about it. We'll find him. We'll search every tree. We can't go now. Why? Why on earth can't we, Hernando? The crown forbids us. We're ordered to stay in Cusco and govern it. We just can't abandon it. We'll go when we get permission. Please use some common sense, brother. Permission? Common sense? Oh yes, common sense. The common sense that this bastard's still alive and you refuse to do anything about it. Please, Gonzalo. He's hiding an empire. Can't you see that? Cusco is only a tiny sliver of what's out there. Why do you think he gave it up so easily? Why do you think Almagro left when he did? The crown forbids us to go elsewhere. Please understand, Gonzalo. Gonzalo stood up and took out his sword. Then he shouted, "The crown? The crown? Who is the king to say who I am? Who is Spain to say who we are? Do you hear them? Can they hear us? But if by chance you do, if by chance you see the king, if you were to see him prancing around this horrid jungle, please do me a favor, brother. Kiss his feet, shake his hand, steal his crown, and shove it up his ass! Crown is blind, Hernando. We are not her servants anymore. I am my own man. This is our empire. Our home is here. Spain? Glorious Spain? What does Spain have what we lack? Tell me. Land? Have we not seen God yet? Is this not the navel of the earth? What else does Spain have that we haven't? Wine? More churches? Gold? Gold, brother? History, said Hernando. History, said Gonzalo, nodding his head. You're absolutely right. History. We don't have a history. We'll have to start it then. And with that, Gonzalo departed. Hernando knew Gonzalo would have his way, and with Francisco gone in Lima, Hernando remained the only Pizarro left in Cusco. And in his solitary, Hernando thought long and hard about Gonzalo and his obsession. Gonzalo wanted not just to capture Manco, he wanted to humiliate him and kill him in front of all the Incas. The only question was who would go along with him. And as always, it was only a matter of time. It happened all too fast. The Incas simply disappeared. We watched them head off to the jungle. Every man left in Cusco remained angry. Even the slaves and servants who remained with us staggered in misery. We kept waiting for another ambush, but the Incas did not show, and our questions remained unanswered. I found Soto sitting on a stump. He sharpened his sword against the white stone of the walls. Then he glared at me. I tested his silence and sensed that he was in such a mood that he could go on like this for a month without saying a word. I, for one, felt the same way. I felt absolutely numb. It wasn't disbelief. I fully believed what had happened, and that's what made it all too numbing. Soto took to his pen and parchment and spent the entire afternoon in deep calculation. My suspicion was that he was calculating his fortune and what it amounted to. He always did his own calculations. He was impeccable at it, and he never let the treasury count a single coin. I heard his reasoning in my mind, for he stated it many times. Why should I, Sardina? I've earned this myself. They have no say what I do with it. At dusk, I joined him by the fire. For the entire night, Soto didn't speak. We didn't play the game either. I didn't even set up the board. I couldn't think. I simply forgot how. I looked up to the gray sky. It seemed calm and dead. All that time we stared, not at each other, but at the city, and how empty it looked. From time to time, I glanced at Soto, but not for very long. Had I known it was his endgame, I would have acted differently. Had I known anything, I would have said something, but I didn't. The truth of the matter was that I was too dumb to understand, and I didn't understand until years after. And it was clear that after Francisco departed, Soto had virtually no say in any matters. Seeing that there was nothing to say, I stared in silence and slept the night away. The silence sufficed. Dawn broke. And like always, Soto got up to his feet and disappeared. Gonzalo assembled his men in the morning, and they gathered and formed the line. I looked at them from afar, and I leaned against a moss-covered rock. They were paid in advance. I looked at their eyes, their eager, hungry eyes. Again, I was caught by the spell. Men with hardly any teeth. Men with broken jaws that slung and drooped. Men with patches on their eyes. Men with no regard for anyone other than themselves. Men who only wanted enough gold so they could retire and never have to work another day in their lives. These men had their reasons, and most of them were young. By the end of the day, more than 200 men had signed to join Gonzalo in his quest for Manco. Gonzalo would take one more day of offers, and the most qualified would fill the last spots. I had one more day to decide. All throughout the day, I stood puzzled, and all throughout the night, I thought about my next move. Needless to say, I couldn't find Soto. My intention was to think all night and die of exhaustion. I made half of that promise. I kept my distance from the men and refused their invitations to drink and talk amongst the fires. I set up the board and arranged the pieces in a quandary. During the night, it stared at my fortune. It was enough. I hadn't spent nearly what I thought I did, but the chest felt lighter. I thought of securing some of it into a secret hole of some kind, so if I were to lose it all, I'd still have something to fall back on. But Cusco was filled with these buried savings. Cusco was quite literally a graveyard of blood and gold, and my biggest fear was that I would forget exactly where I buried it if I'd done such a thing. I stared at my fortune again for what seemed like an hour. Then I realized that I had fought too hard for it. To simply bury a small amount seemed ridiculous. It seemed like a giant waste of time and effort. So I decided to carry the burden. I'd carry it all the way back to Spain if I had to. The fire burned, and I stared up at the stars and searched for an answer, and I watched the pieces reflect and flash against the firelight. Like most men, I was caught in between the present and the future. But, unlike most men, I knew what both were. I knew what Cusco was. It was glorious and sacred. It was worth defending. At least it seemed like that on the surface. It was the essence of the dream, but still, somehow, it didn't feel enough. That was the present. It was a hell I knew, but no longer wanted to live in. Then, there was the future. It remained unexamined, and it bothered me to no end. To find Manco, to find El Dorado. Those were our objectives. Both seemed so unlikely to occur. Lies and truths. My mind fell in between. And I felt as empty as the days of wandering on the beach in Panama. I thought I'd never feel that empty feeling ever again. But no, I felt it, and it felt exactly the same. The feeling of complete emptiness. The feeling that my life had not been lived, and that my time on earth was over. The feeling that my life amounted to nothing, and to say otherwise was just lying to myself. There had to have been a remedy. There had to be something to quell the pain. This couldn't be my endgame. There was still too much to explore. And maybe it was El Dorado. Maybe that would be my panacea. And maybe, deep down, I didn't want the dream to die. There wasn't enough gold. There just wasn't. There were other worlds and other riches just waiting to be discovered. I looked at the board again. It seemed to make all the sense in the world. And it related. I finally saw it. I finally saw what it was and what Soto hinted about for so long. It was clear as day. This was the end game. And so much was on the line. We simply hadn't captured the king. We still needed to capture Manco. The Incas hadn't many pieces left. We had plenty of pieces, and virtually all the time in the world. And although Gonzalo's strategy was aggressive, it made sense to put a concerted effort to kill Manco as fast as possible. Atahualpa was captured in a gambit. Manco would have to follow suit, and the reward would be the El Dorado he fled to. I grew very tired, but I forced myself to focus even more. Everything mattered. The game and the reality were the same. I estimated what could go wrong. I drew the fact that I could either die in the jungle or return back richer than 90% of all the men in the world. I was already as rich as I'd ever possibly thought I could be. But in various points of wishful thinking, I still arrived at one conclusion. In the morning, I would fall in line and join Gonzalo. There was no other alternative. The dream would continue. I was still blind to it. Then I nodded and drifted and slept on the cold ground. I saw myself in Cusco, not for my entire life, but a good percentage of it. I saw myself very much still alive, older and wiser, a man that my younger self could have learned a great deal from. I looked like a man much like the men I always admired. The dream told me things I already knew. I was going to die anyway. What was the point of refraining? I awoke and felt the rain fall on my face. I turned my head in haste and peered from side to side. Then I heard a noise. It sounded like a howl. I clutched at my chest and my heart pounded like mad. The howl switched to laughter. It was Soto. "Stop dreaming, Sardina." Soto stood 50 yards away. He laughed again as he mounted his horse. Then he stopped, dismounted, and walked towards me. Along with him were 4 Inca servants and 2 mules that carried his supplies. Though he always made much sense, he didn't that day. I made a point to defend my decision, but the real truth was that I wanted him to join me for another adventure. I wanted him by my side so I could learn more from him, so I could understand everything and survive and appreciate and share the rewards. But I knew he would never buy my reasoning. The last things I said to him were self-righteous and pathetic, but I held on to those words as if they were my last possessions. And neither Soto nor myself convinced each other otherwise. "You're coming too, Soto?" "Huh. You're still stupid after all these years." "So what is it? Where are you headed? Aren't you joining?" "No. I'm leaving." "Leaving?" "Yes, Sardina. Leaving." "Where to? Lima? To Francisco?" No. To Spain. To Badajoz. I don't understand. You've come too far. I've come for my fortune. I've found it. Now I must leave before I lose it. But there's more, Soto. There's more. El Dorado. You haven't played the game long enough, Sardina. One must learn what he has. There are times when you shouldn't take a risk, even if there's great reward. But the reward is worth it. That's why you're here. That's why we're all here, isn't it? I wish you luck, my friend. I'm afraid that's all I can do. But it's El Dorado. They say it's grander than Cairo, grander than Cusco. It's near. It's near, Soto. Only in your mind, Sardina. But that's what they've been saying. That's what led us here. That's what led us to Peru. That's what led us out of Spain. Why don't you see, Soto? I see my fortune, and I'm taking it with me. Enjoy it, then. Enjoy your tiny fortune. I'll enjoy my fortune, however tiny it may be. I'll enjoy it alive. Soto mounted upon his horse and headed out. I followed and pleaded for him to stop, but I knew it was only in vain. Sir Soto! Then he said his final words, and he disappeared through the dark. And that was the last I saw of him. You're a free man, Sardina. Act like one. I still thought it was a dream, but it wasn't. It was real. It occurred. Soto was gone. An hour later, I fell in line and joined with the others. Gonzalo sounded a list of commands, which I fulfilled, and by noon, we headed off. I remember the wooden gates close and the clanking sounds they made. I never knew it would be the last time, but it was. I glanced at the gold makers at the far end of the city just before the gates. They were still at constant work, churning out their product. I remember their dirty, happy faces. I saw them dig and catch and forge and press, and as the hot liquid formed into their chambers, I remember their sounds. The pangs, the pings, the sizzles and swishes. I stopped one last time to see the foams of gold fill out to the brims, and although I never knew the reason, it all still looked beautiful to me. But I had to accept the fact, and when I did, I could not look back. The fact was that Cusco was a ghost now. It was good as dead. I accepted it and marched forward. And when the gates closed, I knew I would never see this part of the dream ever again. The Incas followed the trail and forged on to the sacred valley. As the thousands of Incas concentrated on their walk west, they kept their heads held high and the sun warmed their faces. The sacred valley was a mighty vista, but it was much more than that. It was a refuge, a safe haven for all the Incas, for it stretched out in a lush of rolling green hills and extended far beyond the jungles. Manco led his people convincingly, for after Sacsayhuaman, they wholly believed in him. They put their faith in his presence. They were willing to die for him once more, and they knew in their heart of hearts that beyond the valley they would make their stay. They walked for miles and days at a time, but internally, they knew that the sacred valley would be their point of arrival. The Incas challenged themselves to walk further, and as the next day's walk ended, they bidded the sun farewell and welcomed the dusk and early night stars. During the night, the Incas sat and watched the sky. Flakes of snow fluttered down from the mountains, and the people smiled. Hundreds of Incas gathered around a circle and let out a cheer. The shaman approached from the shadows and joined them, and each night they began another ceremony. The stars appeared soon after, and the Incas watched the pale purple light blend in the horizon as the majestic Machu Picchu came into view. The peaks stood there like they always did, and they glowed and greeted the Incas like old friends. Manco spoke to his people each night and made the same promise. He knew his people were still shocked and saddened, so he promised that they would build a new Cusco beyond the valley. He promised he would build a new city, a new home to cherish and defend. They stared at the green moss of the sloping hills, the undulations, the protrusions, the enveloping endless lands, the rocks and melting snow, and the terraces that Manco's people had built centuries ago. The vision swirled but stayed, and it went on forever as a constant reminder that this beautiful land would always be their home. Manco repeated his promise to his people several times. The Inca royal court did as well. Each citizen in Cusco was informed of the vision. In the valley, they would build their new Cusco. They would build it, populate it, and make it their own. It would be the Cusco for their children and their children's children. Inca gods would guide it, and it would be Inca blood that would defend it. They were resolved to keep it and protect it. They would fight battle after battle. It was still a dream, but nonetheless, it was every Inca's solemn duty to keep their dream alive. The Inca trail went for more miles. They saw irrigated waterways and walked on. They inched closer and closer to the peaks. Several weeks had passed. Manco found himself alone and stared at the peaks for several hours. He stared at the snow and the green ridges that bulged out in jagged formations. This was his only confirmation. He needed it more than any moment in his entire life. He sought the truth. He put all his faith into the mystery. He closed his eyes and went beyond. Then he opened his eyes. "I am Manco Inca," he whispered. He repeated again. "I am Manco Inca." The shaman approached. He didn't utter a word. He merely gave Manco a smile, then disappeared beyond the slopes. The next day, the Incas reached the holy Amazon River. They prayed for the entire afternoon. Towards the night, Manco sauntered through the jungle alone. He bled from his hands and sucked the blood that dripped out from his fingers. Then he saw a great sight that made him stop. Beyond the stream, Manco watched a giant black puma hunt down and devour an elk. It took less than 5 seconds. The puma chewed and swallowed its meat without hesitation. There was not a shred of guilt in the puma's face, nor was there any uncertainty. There was only joy. But there was a deeper meaning to this instance in time, and Manco felt it. It was not only the hunt, it was a prayer said without words. For both the puma and the elk, it was their nature. Life was lived, and that's all that mattered. As for the elk, he knew that his time on earth would not be long. It never is for the chaste. But the elk showed grace and temperance, because before its death, it was quite alive. It gnawed on the grass and foraged. Its eyes were wide, just like its father. And when it ran, it galloped with every fiber of its soul. The elk neither hoped nor dreamed, nor did the puma. They didn't think. They merely acted. They merely survived. They merely thrived. And the dance continued. Manko probably saw their dance every day, but it wasn't until then that Manko understood it for what it was in whole. It wasn't until then that he knew the entire truth. And when the moment passed, Manko watched and nodded, and noted the power of both beings. The next morning, Manko arose and examined the deep and wide Amazon River. It was cold and holy, sacred and forever. Manko walked up to the fallen streams and watched the flying fish jump over each other. Then he examined the whole of the river, the happy river that he knew his entire life. Indeed, to the Incas, the river was a god itself, and it was one of Manko's favorite gods. He had taken it for granted so many times that he became blind and numb to it. But when Manko saw it again, tears ran down his cheek. He sensed every inch and every sound. He sensed the hum of the insects and the plops and sumps of the drifting ebbs and flows. Then he sensed the shrieks and shrills that came from the birds above. And Manko noted and remembered. He was still living in sacred times. The river kept churning, and Manko kept staring. He felt the entirety of his land and his people swirled into his eye. He spoke to each of his gods. Then Manko lifted his head and stared into the jungle's canopy. He stared below. His hands became still, and he moved towards the river. He soaked his feet as the water came to his waist. Then he dipped his head and submerged his entire body. He felt each surge and pulse of the waves. He felt the chill, and as he closed his eyes, he took it all in. When he was ready, Manko withdrew his head from the water. He took in deep, powerful gorges of breath and clutched onto his pounding heart. Then Manko climbed up to dry land and sat down. His heart pounded. He closed his eyes, then opened them. And the river rolled on and slushed. Then Manko closed his eyes again. He stayed still and watched the tide. In a very long dream, he communicated with Cora. All that needed to be said, he said to her with his eyes. They made love like they always did, and all was whole again. They talked and sauntered through hills and streams. Manko's love for her was as strong as it ever was, and he knew that if he died, he would die loving her. And if the roles had been reversed, it would be exactly the same. Then Manko opened his eyes again. He turned and saw Tito approach him. Again, his son stood by his side. What the future held, Manko did not know. What the past said to him, he held it with reverence. But he knew that the horrors and fears no longer had control of him. He tried to find the right words to express these feelings to Tito. None were needed. He cradled Tito along his shoulder and kissed his forehead, and Tito watched the fish tipple in and out of the streams. Then beyond the river, to the other side of the basin, Tito looked at the lands beyond. Then he looked up again and saw his father smile. They gave the river a firm nod. Manko then hoisted Tito up to his shoulders and pointed his finger west, beyond the river, further into the valley. Another day came. The Incas greeted the sun and cheered. They cried with their hands outstretched to the skies, for they were finally close enough to see Machu Picchu in all its majesty. They stared as the cold air pierced their faces. The sight swirled and stayed, and went on forever. It's still here, said Manco. It's still here. It's always been here, Manco, said Wamampoma. It will always be here. Like your brother. Wamampoma pointed off into the distance. Out of the caves, the high priest yelled out. The shaman walked forward. The Incas cheered again, and Manco blinked several times. Sweat ran down from his nostrils down to his knees. He moved in closer. Then he knelt to the ground. A band of a dozen Incas carried a heavy tomb along their shoulders. Inside was the mummy of Atahualpa. It was wrapped in fine cloth and had been dressed with palms. Atahualpa's distinct scent hovered in the air, and Manco touched the corpse as the sun warmed his face. He didn't hear Atahualpa's voice. Rather, he felt him flowing through his blood. United forever. Then Manco raised his head and prayed to the sun. I know you're here, Manco repeated. I know you're here. Then Manco saw his people gathered around the tomb. They touched the tomb and let out their cries. They smiled through their tears. And like that, the Incas could feel again. The sun faded, and a cold breeze blew in, but they warmed their way through. The Incas stayed with Manco and the tomb. They stared at the wondrous vistas of the sacred peaks and navigated their thoughts in reflection. The moment felt too grand. It felt too real and pure. He knew that the love of his people was understood, that he had earned it, and that his people would never let him down. He knew that words were only wasted breath. But most importantly, he knew that these spirits of the Incas, including his brother Atahualpa, were guiding him and his people to better times. Sacred times. They held strong to Manco's promise, and they were defiant to uphold that promise with the highest resolve. In the fallen rain, the flutes played on, and afterwards the Incas danced again to Atahualpa's lilting song. The drums picked up the rhythm, and again the Incas cheered with their faces lit up in unfettered joy. They didn't care how many lives they would lose. They didn't care how long it would take. They would defend their lands and risk their lives. They were ready for any battle, and their faces gleamed with absolute courage. Coronado took another sip from his chalice. I joined him. The room began to spin, but Coronado continued to ask his questions. Somehow, he remembered. So what of Almagro? What of him? How long was he gone? I really don't know. I wasn't with him. I'm not saying you should know, Sardina. You were about to say it, though. I was. You're very quick, Sardina. But if I'm to understand the story correctly, Almagro left Cusco for El Dorado. Did he not? Yes. Yes, he did. But how long was it before he returned? You would have to ask Almagro himself. But that's absurd. I can't, Sardina. Of course you can't. So you're left to assume, like I did. Like I continue to do. And El Dorado? All I know is that he never found it. I would be surprised if anyone did. But why did Almagro return to Cusco? He didn't find what he was looking for. So Almagro and his men set forth their expedition to El Dorado. and off they went. The soon-to-be kings headed south and followed the Andes down through many slopes and rocky terrain. Altogether, there were 100 horses and 100 riders, several other hundreds on foot, and 5 dozen servants and slaves. During the first days, the men's spirits were very high. A mutual feeling had been shared amongst all of them. They felt El Dorado was just a mile away or so. But more so, they felt that history would repeat itself like it did in Carimaca and Cusco. To occupy the silence, some men sang gaudy songs. Others kept to themselves and rode about with a watchful eye. Many of the men who joined Almagro were not present in Carimaca. They merely were spectators. Those who had been through Carimaca, however, possessed confidence as they rode on in their horses. They knew what to expect, and they guided themselves by their instincts and memories. A week passed. The smiles remained. But after a month, the smiles faded. The land became hillier, and undoubtedly the rocks became more jagged and more difficult to pass. Every day the sun shone down, but it provided no warmth. Brisk winds pierced through their armor, and summer had died. The verdant lush of green grass began to decay into pale yellow dung, and the further they rode, the more the land seemed to be stripped of life. Then it began to snow. It started soft and coated the land, then it grew to a considerable blinding pace, but the men rode right through it. More weeks passed, and through many dying suns the men rode on in a collective trance. They looked about, but all was the same. Some thought they had reached a desert. Some knew for sure. For Almagro, many things were on his mind, and at many times he drifted. He thought about luck in general terms, and he thought about the charismatic luck that had always followed him throughout his life. He thought about the tremendous luck he had in Carimaca and Cusco. Almagro was proud. He was proud that his family name would live on with Diego, and as he thought of his own father, he could see history and legacy all spelled out for him. It finally all made sense. And for days, Almagro kept to himself, knowing that even a brighter future was around the horizon. Dark nights passed. The expedition continued. The sun blazed on, and Almagro drifted once again. From time well before Carimaca, many assumed that Almagro was a most unhappy man. He certainly was that for the majority of his life. For the majority of his life, he invested too much and gained too little, and it wasn't until Carimaca and Cusco that he admitted that his risk had paid off. And as he rode on to El Dorado, he held his head high, as if to say that it was all worth it. But after a month, even Almagro grew exhausted. But the dream still lingered. And as he rode, he gave into the ceaseless rhythm. As he blinked, the vision came into view, and Almagro became enraptured. He envisioned El Dorado in all its glory. His eyes looked up and down to the city streets. It was grander than Cusco, with gold paved every which way. In the visions, the Golden Man sat on a throne and welcomed Almagro and his men to the Golden City, which made Cusco and Carimaca look like peasant fields. And indeed, every rumor held true. The Golden City went on forever, and reached heaven itself. And gold stretched as far as the eye could see, in terrifying poetry. Then the Gold Man disappeared, and with the empty throne, Almagro finally sat and perched and watched his world from on high. He touched each stone and clutched each chest. Then he looked to the sun and stared at the face of God. And with a stare, he received the confirmation that the sacrifice and struggle were assuaged. And this indeed was its end point, the end point that God had intended. But more importantly, the confirmation signified that these lands would be the Almagros, and theirs alone. Diego would have his share, of course, but the worth of the whole land would be in the family's name, and the legacy would be set for centuries. The entire world would know the power and grandness that were the Almagros, and Almagro would die a happy man. The dream lived on, the dream of kings, the dream that made men live. But the vision evaporated. Almagro awoke, dipped his head, and almost fell off his horse. His mouth had filled with saliva. He dipped his head once more, but caught himself again. From the corner of his eye, he saw Diego keep a vigilant watch, and from the other corner, he saw his men languish on. All Almagro was left with was the reality, and it was even more horrific than he could imagine. The reality was naked, scalped, and left for dead. The reality was the horrific, endless desert. The reality was that they had trekked 50 miles along the coast and found absolutely nothing. In 2 months, they found even less. The cold had finally gotten to their bones. The sun and snow blinded their eyes as they inched closer. But in all that time, they had not found one trinket of silver. Hunger was a daily problem. The men ate what they could find. They searched through desolated sands and brought less and less back with them. Rabbits were considered luxury meals, and snakes and rats proved to be primary staples of their diets. The Inca guides and servants fared worse. They carried and lunged their master's load and languished in their chains. Many froze to death. Many others wanted to die. Dozens of others grew violently ill and dropped to their deaths out of sheer exhaustion. But this did not prevent the Spanish from lashing them, cursing at them, and declaring them useless. And as time wore on, there were fewer servants and slaves to discipline. And more bodies had found permanent homes along the cold, hard ground. More days passed, and there was more of the same. More of the nothing that they were accustomed to. And the desert gave no quarter. More snow fell, and El Dorado was nowhere to be found. And each day was harder than the last. What made matters worse were the hostile tribes. The first tribe was a formidable opponent. The second tribe was even more hostile. In each encounter, diplomacy on either side was not offered. The Spanish thwarted the threatening tribes with crossbows and hand cannons. After each encounter, they took the tribesmen as slaves and relentlessly asked them about El Dorado, but none of them confirmed that such a place ever existed. The expedition met more tribes further south. They, however, were peaceful and hospitable. The Spanish interpreters asked their questions again. After much commotion, 2 tribesmen confirmed a golden land existed not far away. Upon hearing this, the morale of Almagro's men had grown. Consequently, the Almagro's hope inflated. They quickly assembled a meeting with their lieutenants and sergeants, and in a week, the expedition encountered a dozen Lincoln tribes that were said to be located near the south ridge of the mountain. Having consulted each other of the amount and the enormity of the population, the Almagros decided it was best to wait out and begin a negotiation with the tribe in hopes they would find information of El Dorado's whereabouts. And later the tribes provided no such information as such a land ever existed. In fact, They laughed at the Spanish for even bringing it up. The talks continued, and Almagro shared a long, enduring smile with one of the tribe's main chief. Then, when the salutations ended, Almagro took out his sword and decapitated the chief in one swift motion. He screamed at the interpreters to repeat his demands, and the councilmen, chiefmen, and other cohorts bewilderedly complied. Another month had passed. Each day blended into the next. The expedition came across more tribes that boasted they knew El Dorado, but it always ended up the same way. The Spanish asked about El Dorado's whereabouts, but when diplomacy could not be met, the tribes instantly ambushed and attacked, and the Spanish laid waste on them. When the fighting had ceased, the Spanish burned everything in sight. They burned the tribe's huts. They burned their women. They burned until there was nothing human left. And in their plunders, the Spanish took whatever they could find. They took in the tribe's beasts of burden and slashed everything else. They searched underneath the tribe's corpses and smashed their clay pots. They searched through the ash and smoke. Yet time after time, Almagro's men retrieved nothing of value. During nights, Almagro stayed awake. Many thoughts swarmed through his mind. On one particular night, he received word of Manco's revolt in Cusco. Part of him was alarmed, but he kept his emotions intact. He remained calm and stared along the depths of the desert. He stared for an hour, but his mind remained blank. So instead of thinking, Almagro looked at the faces of his men. The general expression on each man was of absolute doubt, anger, and disgust. The men would have cursed the air had they had the energy. They were starved. They earned their rest, but they forced themselves to trek on. For Almagro, a rest meant a devastating thing. A rest would mean the men would have time to think, and that was something he could never afford. Everything, their purpose, and their reality of the situation would be magnified. And that would be a devil of a problem to have. So they went on and trekked the never-ending lands of the South. But there was only more desert and more empty, endless sands. Still, Almagro clung to hope. There was something in his consciousness that told him otherwise. Something told him that they were still close, that El Dorado was only a day or two away. He held on to that devastating hope, and emotionally, he was in the same mental state he was in before he reached Carimaca. But the facts of the matter outweighed all the hope in the world. The fact that the tribes that they ran into were even more hostile than the last. The fact that their march continued to be a slow and painful suicide. And the fact, and ultimately the acceptance, that this expedition was just one bloody failure. But nevertheless, the expedition went on. Then one early morning, Almagro's men came across a large tribe with a very large population. The Spanish were welcomed with shrieks and hollers, and in the thick of the fog, the tribe threw stones and javelins at them. The tribe attacked the Spanish at their weak points, and the sounds of clanging metal and jabbing, piercing wood permeated throughout the entire morning and afternoon. At the end of the day, the tribe managed to stand their ground, and Almagro forced to retreat. The next day, however, Almagro's men returned, and they methodically took their revenge. Though the tribe continued to injure the Spanish by throwing their spears in organized patterns of attack, the end result was predictable slaughter. It was followed by the capture of the tribe's leaders and later their execution. After the slaughter, the questions began. Among the corpses, the men searched for any living soul. They found the wounded. They questioned and tortured them, and relentlessly inquired of their knowledge of El Dorado. The questionings continued throughout the entire afternoon. El Dorado! El Dorado, you bastards! Where is it? The Spanish saw it work in the past. They saw it work with Atahualpa and Catimaca. They saw what pointed swords and bargaining for souls could lead to. They saw it work in such fast and great succession. And they repeated it, almost as if it were an obligatory prayer. A prayer of natural torture. But it didn't work this time. The tribesmen knew nothing of El Dorado. The Almagros pressed their swords among the tribe's leaders' throats and asked their designated questions. But every time the question was asked, the same answer was repeated. The tribesmen knew not of El Dorado. They hadn't even heard of such a place. Had Pizarro been there, it might have gone differently. There might have been a pause. Had Soto been there, perhaps there would have been a longer pause. There may have been time to pause and reflect, to strategically think of other alternatives. The Almagros, however, could not afford the time to think. They were starved beyond reason. El Dorado! Where is it? Show us, you bastards! And again, the tribesmen said nothing. And again, all were beheaded. During a cold night, the men held a private vote and unanimously agreed to end their expedition. Their next course of action was to return to Cusco and take back all of it, including Pizarro's section of the city. And in the morning, Diego informed his father. Almagro, however, refused to say a word to his officers. For 2 whole days, there was no mention of El Dorado. Snow turned back to rain, and with great reluctance, Almagro finally had his conversation with his son. They set up a makeshift tent, and they shivered and spoke. "I've been told 20 of our men were sent up north," said Diego. "Is it true?" "Yes, Diego. It's true." "But why? We know there's no food up north." "I didn't send them for food. I sent them back to Cusco. They'll have a head start. They can fill us in on who's coming and going. That way we can arrive back without any trouble." "So is it final?" "It's final. We'll head back north immediately tomorrow morning." They sighed and the rain had stopped. Along the cliff, they watched the vapid shore. It looked oddly familiar. The air was dry, and the cold wind slashed. "God never made a more unhappy place," said Almagro. "There's nothing here, Father," said Diego. "We're all out of rations. We're all out of supplies. We can't wait any longer." "So we'll take what's ours," said Almagro. "We'll take Cusco. We'll return and take what's ours. Let's go, Diego." And so the expedition to El Dorado ended, and Almagro and his men rode back north. Back to civilization. Back to Cusco. In the jungle, Gonzalo's men remained on Manco's trail. The heat was ungodly, but most of the men kept their armor on. In the falling rain, the Inca sleighs pointed down the slopes of the hill to a hidden pass. The Spanish then proceeded through heavy mud and fallen rocks. In all, 300 men had joined Gonzalo, almost twice the amount that his brother Francisco had when they reached Catimaca. In a week, It looked as if Gonzalo had aged 20 years. Cora rode on a mule and was guarded by her servants and slaves. She neither said a word, nor did she share a glance, but she was always within Gonzalo's reach, and her face grew gray and sad. More evidence of the Incas came to surface. The Spanish found bows and spears on the ground. They found clay pots and wooden baskets. They looked up to the trees. The rain fell at a drenching pace, and the men seeped deeper into thick mud. Another week had passed, but Gonzalo kept his head tilted high and led his men down the slope. Several times tree limbs had snapped, and the men reacted by shooting their hand cannon up onto the dense canopy. They fired round after round, but silence always followed. And as they marched, the hell of the jungle continued. But each man knew they were getting closer. They sensed the Incas were near. They could smell them. I forgot how terrible the jungle was. The heat proved a constant reminder. All day long we prepared for an attack. All day long we lulled ourselves to sleep. I myself found my eyes fixated on the slopes and the green lush of the rolling land. It was a deep green. The air was thin, and the elevation made it difficult to breathe. I staggered for days on end. I wanted to be closer to the ground. I took several rests, but my mind never ceased. I thought of everything. I tried to put it all into perspective. I thought of gods and worshippers. I thought of leaders and followers. I thought of those who lost their way and were guided by a light. Some followed Christ, some followed Mohammed. I followed Francisco. Now, I was following his brother, Gonzalo. I felt many eyes watching me. Perhaps they were. Perhaps I was always imagining. Still, I continued, staring at the slopes and rolling green lush of the hills. I let myself dream again, thinking where I was and how I got here. I thought of the beach and Francisco's line, and I thought of a childhood song I used to sing with my brothers when we tended the pigs to their sties. Then I wondered if I could let the matter drop. I wondered if I could be like Gonzalo, absolutely free of conventional morality. If we were to find Manco, I knew Gonzalo would not hesitate to kill him immediately. His endgame was quite clear. It was brute and immediate revenge. As for my endgame, I was still at a loss. We moved to even more elevated terrain. Then we stopped near a large sandstone cliff. I watched over the west and saw the sunset. The men made fires out of wet sticks. I lay beside a fire and said not a word. I pondered more and thought of Soto. The next morning, I did more thinking and stared at the cliff. The stifling heat of the jungle remained. My head felt heavy. It felt as if someone split it with the blunt edge of a sword. And as the day went on, the heat had finally got to me, and I vomited long and hard. When I recovered, I watched the men from afar. They gave me a general look of concern, but I insisted that I wanted to be left alone. Then I heard soft laughter. It subsided for a while. Then it returned. I saw some of the men climb steps that led up to a high terrace, and their eyes widened. More men shouted. They rushed in haste and gathered. On top of the steps, they discovered golden statues. The further I got, the more statues I saw, The men swarmed up the steps. They knocked each other over and laughed like buffoons. Then I heard a horrendous scream. It split my ears. At first, I thought I was dreaming. I blinked several times. Then I heard the scream again. I turned and looked up to the terrace. Above the steps, I saw an Inca mounted on top of a horse. He screamed to his men. Then hundreds of Incas jumped out from their hiding spots and ambushed us from all sides. And spears fell down from the sky. From one side of the pass to the other, the Spanish found themselves surrounded. Manco led a charge and rode his horse straight into the heart of the Spanish line. But he wasn't alone. About 1,000 Incas followed his lead. The Incas screamed and blitzed. Some Incas flew down from high elevations. Other Incas hid in the hills and launched javelins and heavy boulders from on high, pelting the Spanish and making them fall down the steps. They stabbed the Spanish with spears and knives. The Spanish fired back, but the Incas outmaneuvered them. They stole more Spanish swords, helmets, and horses, and continued their charge. For half an hour, the Spanish held their ground. They fired back with their hand cannons. In the smoke and fog, the Spanish hardly saw what they were shooting at, and the Incas took full advantage. They used sharp splinters of wood and stabbed the cannoneers with jabs to the chest and throat. The Incas continued their attack for another hour. They clearly wanted more. When they lost their spears and fans, the Incas picked up several limbs from the ground and swung them as swords. They struck the Spanish again with sharp, penetrating arrows that split and sliced through armor. A few of the Inca men chased down the Spanish, climbing on their backs and then smashing their skulls wide open with the blunt side of their helmets. Several other Incas went after the Spanish horses, slashing their legs with lances. And one Inca warrior in particular ignited himself on fire and ran into the mass of the fighting. Gonzalo himself fell off his horse, and 3 Incas piled on top of him. But Gonzalo's guardsmen immediately shot the Incas, and they died seconds later. Burning flesh seared the air and blood splattered on the grass. About 50 Spanish soldiers lay wounded on the steps, and the Incas beheaded them with great pleasure. Freshly decapitated Spanish heads rolled down the steps, and the Incas laughed and screamed. 1,000 yards out, the Incas taunted the Spanish with swears and threats. They yelled a collective piercing scream that exploded into the air. And to the Spanish, it sounded like the cliffs had erupted. The Incas smiled. Manco finally stood triumphant. A dying Spaniard lay on the ground, and Manco took out his spear and stabbed the Spaniard in the eye. Afterward, Manco dipped his finger in the fresh pool of blood and tasted it. Then he raised the spear and cried out a yell in Quechua. His shriek echoed. "I am Manco Inca! A Vilcabamba!" The Incas roared. Their eyes shone. The Spanish sounded a retreat, and the Incas continued to pelt them with piles of excrement. And for the first time, the Incas had defeated the Spanish. The Spanish raced down the backstretch of the mountain. All were bloodied and bewildered. They stayed in a state of collective shock for the entirety of the night. They looked at Gonzalo. His face was red and his eyes were filled with rage. He paced around the campfire and shouted incoherently. For the Incas, the celebration continued well into the night. They took their captured Spanish prisoners and cut their throats against the stone slabs. There was a gleam in their eyes. The favor was returned. Of the captured, The Incas attended to one Spaniard in particular. It was a malicious friar who was known to be very cruel to the Incas back in Cusco, and all agreed it was finally time for reparation. The monk shrieked. 2 Incas grabbed his wrist, while 2 other Incas grabbed hold of his legs. The monk continued to scream, and the Incas covered his mouth with their hands. The monk bit down as hard as he could, but his resistance didn't amount to much. They held him there for long and painful minutes, and all the Incas smiled, because they knew exactly what was in store for him. Wamampoma emerged from the fire, holding a large wooden spoon. He smiled and approached the monk with a maddening gleam. The monk continued to shriek as saliva ran down his mouth. He spat in Wamampoma's face, and the Inca slammed the monk on the ground and punched him in the head. Then Wamampoma took out the spoon, dipped it into the kettle, and retrieved a heap of melting gold. The spoon sizzled, and the gold glowed brightly in the darkness. Then Wamampoma drew forward, balanced the spoon, and staggered his way to the monk. He made a signal to his men. They clawed into the monk's mouth and opened it as wide as they could. When the monk saw the heap of boiling gold move towards him, he bled from his eyes. Then Wamampoma inserted the smoldering gold inside the monk's mouth. The monk screamed his last, and the melting gold found its way down his throat and burst from his chest. And the Incas mocked his scream with screams of their own. They greeted the night stars and once more shouted with glee. And the Incas danced until morning. We were miles away from the battle, and we lay beaten and exhausted. Each messenger that approached Gonzalo was treated in the same dismissive manner. He stayed by the fire with his Inca wife, who we all knew was Manco's wife, and he asked not to be bothered. Throughout the night, we wondered if the Incas would ambush us, and the fear pervaded. The next day, I walked in a daze. Many men tried to talk to me. I simply couldn't. I was still numb. Later, I discovered the unavoidable news. Several more scouts reported back to us via Hernando, and all of the messages were the same. Almagro had returned to Cusco. During the night, I faded in and out of sleep. I heard only words and murmurs. None of them made any sense. I didn't know who said these words. I merely guessed and tried to make as much sense as I could from them. Almagro's already there? What do you mean? How could he be? Where's Hernando? He couldn't possibly return to Cusco. It's too soon. He did. He's already there. More news. Is it good or bad? It's terrible. Damn it. Damn it to hell. Damn it all to hell! I walked from fire to fire in search of food. I didn't find any, but I found Gonzalo. He was alone. He glared at me for a full minute, and I still thought I was dreaming. Gonzalo stared up at the moon, and I watched him scream at the sky. In the following days, we trekked the jungle in small groups. If his advisors hadn't convinced him otherwise, Gonzalo would have issued another assault on the Incas, but we were clearly outnumbered, and there was no sense in pursuing further until more troops had arrived. So we stayed close as one unit, bided our time, and waited for the reinforcements to arrive. We found no traces of the Incas, and indiscriminately, Gonzalo executed several guides that he thought had lied to him. Our grimaces returned as we marched through swamps and streams. Day by day, we grew bitter and vengeful. and day by day we wanted nothing other than blood. The reinforcements never came. If they did, I doubt if they would have made much of a difference. After a mile down a narrow path, I saw the river. I had passed it many times, but I never knew how grand it was until then. I stared at it and studied its power, and I was caught in its trance. The Incas called it the Sacred River. It was large and encompassing. If there was a god, this certainly would be it. Pure, strong, and eternal. It was easy to surrender to. And surely if this was a god, it was one I could easily pray to. And I understood fully why the Incas prayed to it every day. I looked beyond and saw Gonzalo's Inca wife, Cora. She too stared at the river, but she was crying. I could tell her sobs were not from grief. She was crying because she wanted to. There was a firm conviction on her face. She stood tall and defiant as we watched the river. She too was caught in the same trance. We stared at the river and watched it flow down, all the way down as far as our eyes could see. Words were meaningless, and when we stared at each other, we each understood. We needn't words. A look was enough. Then the moment was over. Her guards and Inca servants took her away. I stared back into the jungle. It was only a few hours, but it felt like a year. I stared out to the canopy. I stared beyond the streams. I stared at the frogs and snakes, and I waited for the moon. Then someone tapped me on the shoulder. The tap was followed by a smack to the head. I turned around. It was Gonzalo. He told me he wanted to see me in a few hours, and I watched him disappear into the jungle. The hour passed, and a young scout approached me. I was called forward to meet Gonzalo and his appointed sergeants. We were first met by Oriana, who read out loud from a scroll. I nodded off and drifted into sleep, and all of Oriana's words escaped me. I was still exhausted. The river and the slush of the rising tide once again mesmerized me into a dreadful lull. Then Gonzalo entered. I remembered being very sleepy, and after a few more minutes I heard Oriana and Gonzalo bicker back and forth with each other. I tried my hardest to pay attention, but I simply couldn't. Finally, I knew exactly why I was summoned. I didn't need to hear any further discussion. All of Gonzalo's soul wanted to stay and hunt down Menko in the jungle. But Gonzalo didn't have a choice. And the reasoning for his stalling was that he was slowly coming to terms with the fact that Cusco needed to be saved. Then Gonzalo and Oriana went on and discussed the obvious. Again, I heard the words, but didn't pay attention. Instead, I stared back into the river, and I let the words feed into my dreams. Why now? Almagro, that's the only reason. Magro, he's still alive. Apparently he is. The last I heard, he was moving to Lima. You've heard wrong. He's heading to Cusco. Cusco? 3 scouts confirmed it. Why Cusco? He still thinks it's his. But what about El Dorado? You think I haven't thought about that? There'll be no El Dorado if we lose Cusco. But what about Manco? One bastard at a time. I opened my eyes and suddenly I saw Gonzalo approach me with a sack of gold in his hands. He shoved the sack into my chest. It felt heavy and full. He stared at me with a look of concern, and he asked me questions, and I answered with great hesitation. I knew for a fact that my pauses bothered him. No doubt he took this as a sign of my own ignorance, and no doubt he was probably right. The spaces in between our words seemed greater, and the silence was unnerving to him. But I simply couldn't say or do anything else. And words, particularly the right words, never came to me when I needed them. So silence more than not sufficed. "What are you doing, Sardina?" "What do you mean, sir?" "Why do you hesitate?" "Forgive me, sir." "What are you thinking of?" "I'm praying, sir." "Praying?" "Yes, sir." "Who, may I ask, are you praying for?" "The dead." "Never mind the dead, Sardina. Focus on the living." I will, sir." Then Gonzalo gave me his orders. I had been assigned to be in complete charge of hunting down Manco. I remembered Gonzalo's last words, and besides one other horrible thing that happened that day, that's about all I remembered. "Do your best, Sardina. Stay here. Hunt him down." And with that, Gonzalo had left. He returned to Cusco to help his brother Hernando. The rumors were true. The Almagros had returned, and they were back to avenge the city in full force. But before Gonzalo left, he gave one last cruel and horrible speech. "Let the bastard know," he repeated. "Let him know." His words were sufferable. His eyes shone red and festering. Then he gave the order. And when I heard it, I felt my heart drop. I saw the wooden box about a minute later, but there was nothing I could do. About a half hour later, I heard ungodly screams and shrieks. In the distance, I saw Cora fight for her life, as a half a dozen guards chased after her. She bit and scratched and crawled her fingernails into the guards' faces, and that was the last time I saw her alive. An hour later, we were ordered to carry the box all the way back to the river. Inside was Cora's corpse. She had been shot by arrows, and her body was wrapped in banana leaves. The box was light, and 6 of the men, including myself, carried it to the edge of the brook. None of the men shared any emotion. I marked my steps and kept my balance. The other men did the same. We set the box down to the crest of the river, set it aloft, and watched it float down. I didn't see her die, but in my mind I heard her screams as the box floated away. Afterward, a pain went through my chest. I finally felt something. It was a deep feeling that I hadn't felt in a long time. A feeling that I thought I lost. Sympathy. A few days later, Mako saw the same box float down the river. It came and flowed down, and the Incas whimpered in shock and sorrow. At first, Mako merely watched, but as the box floated closer, he cried and prayed. He knew what was inside. He cradled Tito and turned him away. The box floated down the Amazon, and Mako sobbed, winced, and knelt to the ground. The Incas said a prayer through their tears, and when it was over, Mako took Tito by his hand, and they walked away.